Klas Bernhard Johannes Karlgren was a Swedish sinologist and linguist who pioneered the study of Chinese historical phonology using modern, comparative methods. In the early 1900s, Karlgren conducted large surveys of a number of Chinese dialects and studied historical information on rhyming in ancient Chinese poetry, then used them to create the first ever complete reconstructions of what is now called Middle Chinese and Old Chinese. Early life and education. Bernhard Karlgren was born on 15 October 1889 in Jönköping, Sweden. His father, Johannes Karlgren, taught Latin, Greek, and Swedish at the local high school. Karlgren showed ability in linguistics from a young age, and was interested in Sweden's dialects and traditional folk stories. He mastered classical languages and was an accomplished translator of Greek poetry into his native language. He displayed an early interest in China, and wrote a drama, The White Hind, set in that country in his early teens. His first scholarly article, a phonetic transcription, based on a system devised by Johann August Lundell, of traditional folk stories from his native province of Småland, was completed when he was 14. And published in 1908 when he was only 18 years old. He studied Russian at Uppsala University under Johann August Lundell, a Slavicist interested in comparative linguistics. He graduated in 1909 with a bachelor's degree in Nordic, Greek, and Slavonic languages, although he initially intended to specialize in the Scandinavian languages. On the advice of his elder brother Anton Karlgren, he decided to focus on Chinese instead, attracted to it also by the fact that, as Lundell had told him, Chinese contained a great number of dialects. He departed for St. Petersburg, where, under the guidance of Vasily Vasilyev, the city had created one of the major European centers for the study of Chinese. While there, Karlgren, studying under I. Ivanov, won a grant to study Chinese dialects, even though he had no background in Chinese at the point. Karlgren lived in China from 1910 to 1912. He achieved basic fluency and literacy after only a few months of study, and prepared a questionnaire of 3,100 Chinese characters to gather information on Chinese dialects. After his grant money ran out, Karlgren supported himself by teaching French and, famously, English, which, according to one anecdote, he had never been taught but had picked up from English-speaking passengers on the ship from Europe to China. In fact, he had received a high credit in English in his final high school exams. He eventually gathered data on 19 different Mandarin dialects, as well as Shanghainese, the Fuzhou dialect of Eastern Min, and Cantonese, plus the Vietnamese and Japanese pronunciations of the characters in his questionnaire. Career. Karlgren returned to Europe in January 1912, first staying in London, then in Paris, before arriving in Uppsala, where in 1915 he produced his doctoral dissertation, Études sur la phonologie chinoise. Although his dissertation was written in French, most of his subsequent scholarly works were in English. After obtaining his doctorate, Karlgren taught at the University of Göteborg, serving as its president from 1931 to 1936. In 1939, Karlgren succeeded Johan Gunnar Andersson as director of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, a post he held until 1959. This public museum was founded in 1926 on Andersson's pioneering discoveries of prehistoric archaeology made in China in the 1920s, and later expanded to cover later periods as well as other parts of Asia. Karlgren had been in close contact with Andersson for many years, and also succeeded Andersson as editor of the museum's journal, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities and continued in this position until the 1970s. Karlgren himself first published many of his own major works in this annual journal, or as books in the monograph series of the museum. In 1946, Karlgren began a far-reaching attack on the then rather loosely argued historiography of ancient China, reviewing the literature on China's pre-Han history in his article Legends and Cults in Ancient China. He pointed out that a common feature to most of these treatises is a curious lack of critical method in the handling of the material. In particular, Karlgren criticized the unselective use of documents from different ages when reconstructing China's ancient history. In this way, very full and detailed accounts have been arrived at, but accounts that are indeed caricatures of scientifically established ones. In 1950, Karlgren was inducted into the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Death. Karlgren died on the 20th of October 1978 in Stockholm at age 89. Legacy. Karlgren was the first scholar to use European-style principles of historical linguistics to study the Chinese language. He was also the first one to reconstruct the sounds of what is now called Middle Chinese and Old Chinese. Karlgren suggested that at the very earliest stage recoverable, the personal pronouns were declined for case. Karlgren attempted to unearth Chinese history itself from its linguistic development and diffusion. As he writes in his English adaptation Sound and Symbol in Chinese, Chapter 1, thus, though Chinese traditions give no hint whatever of an immigration from any foreign country, and though there consequently is no external chronological point d'appui, we are nonetheless able to state, from internal evidence, that the Chinese tradition which places the reign of the Emperor Yao in the 24th century B.C. is correct, that the Chinese even in those remote times were skilled astronomers, that they put down in writing in the Chinese language records of memorable events, and in all probability wrote their accounts soon after the events. In short, that a well-developed Chinese civilization, resting undoubtedly on foundations many centuries old, together with the Chinese language, existed on Chinese soil 2,000 years before Christ. Although important as a pioneer of historical Chinese linguistics, Karlgren's original findings have been surpassed. Today the phonological systems proposed by Karlgren have largely been superseded, as the weaknesses are obvious. Karlgren saw himself as reconstructing phonetics, not phonology, and paid little attention to phonological structure. As a result, the systems he reconstructed often lack the symmetry and pattern which are in the phonological systems of natural languages. Nevertheless, Karlgren's groundbreaking works laid the foundation of modern Chinese historical linguistics, and many of his works are still used as works of reference. Selected works. Études sur la phonologie chinoise, 1915–1926. Audeoch Penan I Mittens Reich, 1918. Adapted as Sound and Symbol in Chinese, London. Oxford University Press, 1923. Reprinted 2007, Toronto. Global Language Press, ISBN 9780973892406. The Reconstruction of Ancient Chinese, T. Ung Pao, Volume 21, pp. 1–42, 1922. Analytic Dictionary of Chinese and Sino-Japanese, Paris, Paul Guthner, 1923. Reprinted by Dover Publications, ISBN 9780486218878. The Authenticity of Ancient Chinese Texts, Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, 1929. The Early History of the Julian Tso Xuan Texts, Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, 1931. Word families in Chinese Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, 1933. New Studies on Chinese Bronzes Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, 1937. Grammatis Arica, Script and Phonetics in Chinese and Sino-Japanese, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1940. Hua and Han, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1941. Glosses on the Kuo Feng Odes, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1942. Glosses on the Siao Ya Odes, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1944. Glosses on the Tao Ya and Sung Odes, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1946. Legends and Cults in Ancient China, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1946. The Book of Documents, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1950. Compendium of Phonetics in Ancient and Archaic Chinese, the Bulletin of the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, Stockholm, 1954. Grammatis Arica Recensa, Stockholm, Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities, 1957. In Swedish he published numerous popular works on Chinese language, culture and history. In the 1940s he published 3 novels under the pen name Klas Bernhard